Good morning and welcome to this live debate on advisor technology and specifically its role in assessing client suitability. My name is Scott Sinclair and I'm the editor of Professional Advisor. Are advisors becoming too reliant on technology? Has its rise introduced an element of complacency into the advice process? And are the various tools that advisors use too disparate to be of proper use when assessing clients' needs? These are among the topics that will be discussed this morning by our panel, which consists of Chris Pitt, who is Head of Market Analysis at IRESS UK. We also have Abraham Okusanya, who is Principal at Finalytic. And last, but by no means least, we have Mark Loosemore, who is an Executive General Manager on the wealth side at IRESS UK. Now, as I mentioned, this is a live event, so please do contribute. You can ask the panel a question at any point. You should have an Ask a Question tab on your screen. Simply click that and post your question, and it will come through to me here on this supercomputer. Likewise, do contribute also to our polls. There should be two going live through the course of the morning. The first one around about now, asking whether firms anticipate spending more or less on technology over the next 5 years or so. This is also a CPD accreditable event. I will provide you more details about how to claim those points a little bit later on. However, let's get straight into it. Abraham, is technology improving the advice process, yes or no?
I think overall, individually, the technology tools that advisors use in the delivery of advice has got better. They got significantly better. So risk profiling tool, research tool, back office system, platforms, they've all got better individually and they have improved the delivery of advice. I think collectively though, because these tools don't really talk to each other as much as they should, integration is still a big issue in the industry generally, and because advisors want to use best of breed technology, they might want Finametrica for their risk profiling, they want IRESS for their back office, they want FE for their fund research, and all of these tools might not be talking to each other, which increases the amount of rekeying that advisors have to do, consequently increases the room for error. So yes, technology has improved the delivery of advice, but I think there is still a long way to go.
A long way to go. Chris, would you agree with that?
I would certainly agree there is still a long way to go, but I think it's also interesting to look back and see how far we've already come. I think the application of technology has enabled the process itself to be delivered far more consistently, accurately, and I'm picking up on your point there about rekeying. I think progress is beginning to be made in that area. We are seeing more tools being integrated to each other, and I think we're seeing tools that are becoming more holistic and actually incorporating some of those capabilities. So I would agree there's still perhaps a long way to go, especially I think around the way that actually advisors use them to interact with their clients, and that's I think a very significant area of development. But I think yes, the tools have made a very significant difference. Sometimes we overlook how far we've come.
Okay. And Mark, what are your thoughts on this general idea of technology's impact on the advice process?
Well, firstly, I think it's interesting to pick up on that integration piece, because I think there is no doubt that the tools haven't been as integrated in the past. We are seeing that improve, but as Chris indicated, the breadth of what each tool is doing now tends to increase. So you'll find tools that will not only be the back office, but will address the research capability, etc. And that has the added benefit that then have one interface, one user experience going into that, as well as consistency of data across that. And if we go back, I remember speaking a couple of years ago to an advisor that was using a variety of different tools and entering the name and address of a client 21 times during the advice process.
21 times?
Yeah, 21 times. So you just think that can't be efficient. It can't even be accurate because you build in room for mistakes. So bringing that onto a single advice platform platform, or failing that, an integrated advice platform has to be a benefit. The other area that I think we mustn't lose sight of that we're getting benefit from is that this isn't just about a one-off advice process. We're now in the world of service, so we're talking about an advice service, and that's an ongoing process. And through technology, I think we can really start to bring forward the right moments to contact the client and give ongoing service, not just take people on that sort of onboarding moment. It's a continuous process that we're looking at now.
Okay, thank you. What about this element of complacency? I did ask a handful of advisors before today whether they felt the rise of financial services technology, fintech, had introduced the danger of complacency and losing that nuance with the face-to-face element with clients. And I wondered sort of what the panel thought of that. Specifically, Chris, what do you think about that element of complacency?
I think it certainly is an important point, because as we've introduced more tools which take the grunt out and the hard work out of doing some of the analysis, etc., there is that danger of people becoming, as you say, complacent and just relying on the tool. It becomes a bit of a black box, and so it almost gets to the situation where you could say, well, the computer says that's the answer. And I think where the advisor needs to add value, and I think this is a point that the FCA really stress, is the advisor's got to understand and appreciate how those tools actually work, appreciate what they're doing for that situation, and identify situations where perhaps that's not quite right for this customer circumstance. So I think there is a danger, but it's also, I think, an opportunity for the advisor to demonstrate the value which they're bringing to that, because otherwise why couldn't the customer just use the tool on their own? It's that extra level of insight and ability which the advisor brings to the party, which I think is the counteract to the complacency.
But I also think that you can have complacency in any industry and doing any job, but actually if you look at what technology has done in many instances, it's actually stretching the level of advice that can be given and doing the opposite of complacent. I mean, how many people were doing cash flow planning 5 years ago? And now that you've got more cash flow planning tools out there, we're now enabling more advisors, not just the ones that were great at creating their own spreadsheets, to actually stretch themselves and offer that service. So far from being complacent, I think it's helping people grow their services. So there is always a complacency danger on anything, but we shouldn't focus on that. We should look at the added services that are now coming as an advantage. Sure,
but it is a concern of the regulator. Rory Purcell has mentioned it a couple of times. We've heard phrases such as shoehorning from the regulator over the last few years, and obviously that is because of the rise of technology, in particular centralised investment propositions and their role in the advisory business nowadays. Abraham, what's your thoughts on this?
I think with the practice management side of things, I don't see much complacency specifically with risk profiling and the centralised investment proposition. I think there is the danger, and I think there is some complacency there, and that's because the way these tools been designed to say, for instance, take the client through a set of questions for their attitude to risk, and as a result of that produce some sort of asset allocation which then fits them into portfolio 5. It does take a bold advisor and an advisor who understand what it is that how those tools are made. You talked about the idea of black box, to actually question them, to question the outcome. They're the ones who can feel and touch the client sitting in front of them, and they're the ones who are able to say, I don't think portfolio 5 fits in this particular instance because X, Y, Z, and to be able to document that. And I think that if they're able to go through that thought pattern, understand what the tool does, and document whatever tweaks they've had to make. I think that's perfectly fine. Yes. The point though is that that should be an exception rather than the rule. What's the point of having a process if you keep breaking it and having to to go down a different direction?
I think the technology itself is becoming more advanced. So as you're going through and perhaps using a risk profiling questionnaire, inconsistencies and extreme answers can be identified and sort of flagged out to the advisor in terms of, this seems slightly odd. So, as I say, the technology itself can aid the advisor more and more to, I think, as I say, help with that complacency issue. At the end of the day, it's still that responsibility.
Yeah.
But I think the tech can get smarter as you go.
Compare that to, again, going back 5 years ago and talk about the complacent advisor there would actually have 5 risk descriptions and just say, Mr. Customer, choose one of those 5 risk descriptions.
Yes.
And that's complacent. So at least we're now narrowing the chance of being complacent. And you can never completely legislate against it. And they absolutely have a responsibility to understand the tool, to do the due diligence before they select the tool, make sure they understand the workings of the tool so they can get to those moments and point out when it's wrong. But we mustn't forget that where we were 5 years ago wasn't that was worse. I think people had very loose descriptions that people were selecting from by almost dropping a pin on a box.
Sure. Okay. I'm just going to introduce a little sort of side angle to this then. So I think there's complacency, but there's also wanting to be safe and secure with your recommendations. So the technology is helping you do that. But there is a lot of talk with advisors at the moment about how the Ombudsman would determine a case, and you were saying, Abraham, about making sure you properly document any tweaks you might make to the recommendation the tool makes. But some advisors, for some advisors, this is just very common sense. They clearly document it. They're very secure. If there were ever to be a complaint, that this is how they documented it and this is how it was agreed. But there is some concern with how the regulator and the Ombudsman would judge that advice.
Yes.
So is technology maybe making things, introducing that problem of wanting to be safe? So if I do what the tool recommends, then I've got a much cleaner argument in the future, as if I make some tweaks, there are more questions for me.
I think, as Mark says, and looking back, we've come an awful long way improving the quality of the documentation and the evidence. I think we're almost now sort of nudging into the world where the FCA, the FOS, etc. are saying, but did the customer actually understand the advice that was being given? So we've come a huge long way, and the technology has been great for that. And I think where we need to travel a bit further is around that financial capability piece and understanding I've documented everything correct, it's a great solution, but the FOS would say, but the customer clearly didn't understand it. And I think that's where, if we can get into perhaps just another level of checking, questioning, etc., to make sure that the customer did understand and that's recorded, then I think that takes us another step forward.
So this really is about documentation and making sure the record keeping is tight. To what extent has fintech impacted on individual product selection or solution selection for a client, and what are the safeguards? So we've obviously slightly touched on this issue so far, but Abraham, what are your thoughts on the direct impact technology has had on selecting an end product for a client who needs one?
I think, again, that has improved. We've moved away, I hope, from a world where product providers were fiddling around with risk profiling tool to get a certain outcome or to fit their own investment proposition. Advisors have recognized that they need to use independent research tools for their product research and selection. So it has got better. There are still areas where you need some improvement, but we're beginning to see signs of. So, say for instance, things like DFM selection. There's still a lot of room for improvement there. But overall, it has improved.
Okay. And Mark, what do you think are the safeguards here when it comes to using technology to select a solution? What are the safeguards advisors need to ensure they're putting in place?
Well, I think a lot of the systems enable now people to put their own safeguards in. Certainly for the larger firms can have centralised teams that can build in safeguards. I think also within the solutions you can now have checkpoints. You can build in compliance checks as you go through a process. You've also got sophisticated case checking systems now that used to be available just to the large banks and building societies, being available for people to use in much smaller businesses as well. So I think there's all sorts of ways that technology can start building in business rules to check that things are appropriate.
All right, Chris, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, it's just triggered a thought there around behavioural economics. I think that's something that we're really starting to get to grips and understand. It's not only the way that technology presents and the number of solutions and filtering them, it's how they are presented. I mean, the behavioural economics shows that if you give a customer a choice of 2,000 funds, they get confused. We need to present the choices to consumers, to advisors, etc., in a way that they feel comfortable and happy making those choices and the right choices. So I think the behavioural economics piece, I've seen one smashing example where the same choice of 8 funds was presented on one screen and then split over 2 screens, and the selection of funds was remarkably different, simply by the implication that because the funds on the second page were on the second page, they must be not so good as the ones on the first page for some reason. Absolutely not true, but it just shows you the power that exists in the way that we actually present a choice. And I think that's something that we're, in the financial services industry, just starting to appreciate. I think other industries have appreciated it for a lot longer.
It was the FCA's first paper was on behavioural economics, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that, again, we're talking generically here. There are still very specific examples of bad practices going on. We're still in a world where if you need to do a cost comparison on pension products, you still have to request paper illustration from the provider, and you take that data, you put it in some sort of tool, and then you do the research on that. I still find errors occasionally in the calculations where it doesn't add up. So overall it's improved, but this is not where we need to be in 2015.
Okay, all right. Did you want to add anything to that, Mark?
Well, just making sure that we also take that through to how we communicate anything, not just in the questions, but any of the outputs towards the clients as well. I think people consume information in different ways. So if we're thinking about how, taking this to how we then interact with the end clients and the reports that we produce out there, people need things a lot more concise these days. They can take information from multiple sources, but little snippets everywhere. You know, the social media's taught us to behave in that way, and I think that's going to get stronger and stronger as the generations move through from school now through to the financial world.
I think you're seeing that with the pension passport initiative, which is just starting to happen. Reducing what was a pension wake-up pack, which was 30+ pages, down to at least one single sheet, which is common across the industry, and using standard identifiers. I think as an industry we perhaps need to sort of stand back and say we need to do a bit of standardisation to help the end consumer, to help advisors, etc. So let's all start using the same terminology at least.
Yep.
And if we can get things down and put it onto one piece of paper, there's a chance consumers might actually do something with it, and maybe that would be leading them to take advice. And
maybe, God forbid, we get some engagement. Think of pension illustrations rather than low, mid, high growth. Maybe we'll get to a point where you'd afford some medium-sized car and Lamborghini, and something that actually gives people an idea of what we're talking about.
I think there's some great examples in the US where people are presenting data and engaging with clients using gaming or using far more graphical interfaces that really haven't touched on in this country yet. And I think we really need to learn that engagement piece, and that's going to get more and more important as the younger generations move through.
Okay. I mentioned earlier about the FCA having its say about advisors' use of technology and third-party tools in particular. We have a slide on this for our viewers, which should be going live now, if not very shortly. The FCA has set out its expectations. They are abbreviated on this slide, that it must be suitable for use with your customer base. Obviously, that sounds like common sense. The FCA has to say it. Understand how the tool works, particularly where investment selections are made. Have a robust process to mitigate shortcomings or limitations of the tool. I have abbreviated these, but this brings me on to the next thing I wanted to ask you, which was about the things that technology that we're using today can miss. So is sufficient allowance made for things such as longevity, which is becoming very, very important part of the conversation, not least as part of the retirement reforms? So, Chris, I just wanted to ask you about this issue, about technology missing vital points.
Yeah. I suppose it's perhaps because in industry we've been very focused on the accumulation phase, and and when we were in the decumulation, well, the answer was an annuity by and large, and it was really a question of, well, which company do you buy it from? Since the reforms, that's changed quite remarkably, so there has been a sort of a more emphasis on well, let's talk about retirement now because I've got some options. And suddenly longevity, as you say, people are more interested in that personally. So all the research shows that people underestimate how long they are going to live. And I think that's quite an education point, which I think, there are now technology solutions becoming available to help people understand, well, okay, Mr. Client, actually, you think you're going to live for another 20 years. The statistics show that it's probably nearer 30. And I think that's, really just part of the opening up of the conversation around pension freedoms.
Okay, and Abraham, would you like to add to this?
I think the tools are certainly out there to model possible outcomes. As to whether advisors are using them is a question. It's a big question.
Okay, Mark, anything to add?
I think it's the human dimension ultimately that is, you've got to be careful you don't skip out, because while you can get a result from a computer, actually eyeballing the client and seeing how they're reacting to that result, so particularly like discussing risk profiling, a lot of the value from that comes with the discussion about that risk profile afterwards, so that you make sure that the client understands what the results are. Unless you're in front of the client and you can see the body language, you can understand how they interact. I think you can miss that. I think even when you're then talking about fact-finding and gaining goals information, a lot of people talk about doing that online, which is something I fully support, but when you're then talking about goals, seeing the human dimension of how someone's eyes light up when they're talking about saving up for a particular, their Ferrari or whatever it is, that is the one thing that they're really driven by, and picking up that human dimension is something that the computer is never going to get. So I don't think we should ever forget the human part, particularly when we're doing complex financial advice. And
I think you mentioned there on risk profiling, and I think obviously for in the decumulation phase, risks are different, and actually I think having a different sort of conversation and pointing out the different risks that there are, and obviously taking money out, pound cost averaging works the other way around and becomes a more significant risk. So I think it is very important that don't pretend, well, we had the risk profiling, I know what risk attitude you've got. I think there's a need and a value for having that another conversation, and it's very important that you have that one.
Okay, thank you. We've got some results from the first poll that we ran. So the question was whether you envisage your business spending more on technology or less over the next 5 years. It won't surprise you, I'm sure it doesn't surprise me, that the vast majority, 87.2% of viewers have said they do intend to spend more. So now we are going to put our next poll live on the page, which we'll deal with a little bit at the end of this session. It's about robo-advice. Is the rise of robo-advice a threat or an opportunity for your business? So we will tackle that at the end. I'm sure you all want to have your say about that. We touched upon a little bit about risk descriptions. I have had a question about this, which I will ask after this. But phrases such as capacity for loss, attitude to risk versus capacity for loss, is a very clear difference between the two, but they're often used interchangeably. And capacity for loss is something that the FCA has flagged very recently, I think this year, as something that's still not quite done adequately. So I wanted to ask you about phrases like capacity for loss and the risk descriptions in generally. Are they adequate in 2015? Do customers really understand them? And how can advisors ensure that clients can really understand what they mean? So Chris, if I could come to you with that one.
Okay, the answer is very simple in terms of it's yes and no, because actually, as as consumers, we're all different, and I think the key challenge for the advisor is to recognise the financial capability of the person sitting in front of them. There'll be plenty of customers for whom, you know, capacity for loss is absolutely fine, the right terminology, they understand it perfectly and can have a sensible discussion. There'll be others for whom capacity for loss means absolutely nothing, and it's then the advisor's, you know, role to actually explain that in terms that that individual customer will understand. So, you know, I don't think whatever terminology we come up with and say that's the definition, that's not the answer. It's really understanding the person in front of you and tailoring your communication.
And it depends who the target is for that terminology, because if it's an end consumer, I'm not sure capacity loss is ever the best phrase, to be honest. I mean, how much can you lose? There's a clear. If we're trying to get the industry to discuss it, then maybe. But I think that the risk descriptions go further than that. I still see poor examples of risk definitions that are using words like some risk or stuff that you can't quite quantify and deal with that. And the fact that the FCA is still talking about this and has been for many, many years, it clearly isn't adequate, because we haven't solved this problem. With various tools that can help people through that discussion point, but I think we're still confusing the end client.
Well, I think to the first question, the risk descriptions, do they go far enough? No. The FCA doesn't understand how to measure capacity for loss. It's a very difficult thing to measure by, you know, just by the definition. I've never seen or read or heard any FCA piece that says, here's an example of how you measure clients' capacity for loss. It's by its very nature, it's very difficult to measure. And even the risk, if you go back to the point about risk description, there are some that have gone a bit further to try and explain what it means. So it would say something like, say, in medium risk, you could have, a higher proportion of growth assets and less of defensive, something like that. But what does that mean to an ordinary person? I've seen a risk description that includes the maximum loss in any 1 year over, say, 40-year period, and the maximum gain over any 1 year, to try and give the client some sort of idea of possible losses and gains within their portfolio. But actually, when you think about it and you think, well, what is the real impact on that on a client? If they see the worst case scenario on the eve of their retirement, it's a completely different conversation. And different impact from if that event happens, say, later in life, when they're far more relaxed with expenditure and they've got less time to live. So the point is, by its very definition, risk capacity is a very hard thing to measure. There are stochastic models out there that models different outcomes. We don't do enough, I don't think, in trying to help clients visualize that. Risk profiling tools, feel free to tell me to shut up, but risk profile, cash flow modeling tools are great and useful in helping clients visualize their expenses in retirement, but in deciding the path that their portfolio is probably going to take, I think it fosters an illusion of certainty that clearly doesn't exist in real world.
I think you make a great point there about visualization. Sometimes I think, as an industry, we perhaps get a little too hung up on the definition, a series of words, etc. But I think as Mark and yourself were talking earlier on, we need to bring that to life for people to actually understand, and we need to bring it to life in visual terms, and people obviously understand the concepts. You know, they're probably quite happy to go down to the bookies, place bets, etc. So they understand some of those concepts. It's when we put it into a financial context and perhaps surround it with jargon that they're not familiar with that sometimes they get bored and not interested. It's our role to bring that to life for them, and perhaps, you know, maybe it's through sort of gaming techniques, etc., that you can actually start to, you know, get it across to people. Oh yeah, I understand what you mean now.
And fundamentally, though, it's about a discussion about it, isn't it? So you need the pictures there to help it and to lead people, but you've got to have that discussion with them. And that comes back to the human dimension. You've got to make sure that they understand it. And again, something maybe that if it's completely automated that you miss is that slight confused look in the eye. So you need to be able to talk people through the outputs and give that clear verbal explanation as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you're talking about bringing it to life for customers. We have had a question in from Alan Brown for the panel. He asks, what are your opinions in relation to using WebRTC to communicate with customers, speaking to them through their browser? Are you familiar with this particular
I was going
tool?
to say what it is WebRTC.
I'm not sure, but I think the wider point about speaking to customers through a browser using sort of modern technology to communicate
absolutely
is an important thing. I mean, how important would that be going forward?
Well, I think using different communication techniques to make advice more efficient by not having to travel out all the time is really important. So IRESS originated in Australia, and we had clients out there that we were, you know, out in the remote mines, and the advisors would be in a centre, say in Perth, didn't want to travel all that way out to see them, so they were using techniques to share screens to show modelling, maybe just even video conferencing to be able to to keep the human interface on as well. I think if it's pure sort of discussions type stuff, that still works for some people, but I'm not sure for financial services in terms of the advice part, you can get enough just from typing it, and I think it has to be a visual face-to-face ideally. But you'll see more and more, especially as we try and take advice to the mass market, and who maybe aren't prepared to pay the fees of a face-to-face, someone coming out and seeing them.
I think you see, I mean, you know, the millennial generation, they do everything that way. I mean, and we should just accept that is the way that communication will be done. It's just another form of communication.
Sure.
Why should we necessarily, as you say, Mark, have to travel to talk to people face to face?
And it's not just a geographical distance. We actually found when in Australia that the people that were started using that technology may have been the people in remote journeys, but where it got used most was in places like Sydney, where really busy people weren't prepared to get up and go to see someone. They wanted to talk to someone in their lunch break. I've got half an hour now, I'm going to connect in the city to that way. So it's not just about travelling distance, it is about efficiency of advice sometimes, and so I'm sure it'll take more and more.
You know, people say things, first of all, I'm going to add what Mark said, you know.
Okay, yeah.
But people say things all the time, and they, you know, when they talk about technology and communicating with clients, they think, oh yeah, the younger client, the millennials, you know, people like me rather than Mark. But I think again that's that's not true. You know, my parents are getting on a bit now. They talk to their granddaughter on mobile apps, on
Skype
iPad thing and Skype and all that. So older people are au fait with technology because they're using it with their grandchildren and their children, and so this is something that cuts across generations.
I think you're right. You know, the typical profile of a platform user, direct-to-consumer platform user, is actually a retired colonel in Surrey, actually. So it is people with time and the money, and actually sort of age, as you say, people are, of all ages, are pretty comfortable with the technology. I just sort of make the point that actually even the younger generation, that's all that they use as well. We have to get very, very familiar and comfortable with the fact that it's almost technology first.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you ring a teenager, they don't want to speak to you. They just say, "Why don't you just text me?" Or,
Yeah.
or you know.
But I think the other dimension to this, though, is I think what they do expect is to be able to use those different communication channels as and when they want. So if you just focus on web and you forget the face-to-face, I think you miss a trick. So what you need is your client to be able to contact you without you being there and just look something up, get maybe the valuation online for you, then be able to phone you up and get a consistent answer, and then ask for you to come around and see them the next day, and for you to still have the same service level, same answers, same data in front of you. And we need to be able to communicate with the clients the way they want to, when they want to.
Okay, I think some viewers are waiting for us to talk about risk profiling, so we'll move on to this next. We have had a question in from a Chris Tuck, who asks, isn't there a danger that clients may misinterpret questions on a risk profile tool and result in an unreliable assessment? He says, does the panel consider it essential that the advisor educates and supports the client so they can answer a questionnaire reliably? And Chris, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, having looked through some of the questionnaires, as I say, it comes back down to that financial capability of the person in front of you. There'll be some consumers where absolutely I think you should sit down and walk through the risk profiling questionnaire with them to make sure that they understand the questions, because some of them can be written in terminology which can appear a little bit jargon. And I think, as I think Mark, you said, you know, sometimes you have to be sitting with a client and spotting when, you know, the glaze comes over the eyes. And yes, I think there is a need for you to sit with. That's the value you're adding as an advisor if you're doing things certainly face to face.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I completely agree. I have heard advisors say things like they don't want to influence the client's the client's
their answers.
Their answers. I've also seen behavioral, going back to behavioral finance, that says that when you're sitting in front of two clients, male and female client, and you start to explain the market to them, the male client just wants there's some macho there. They want to demonstrate their skills and impress the advisor, and so they are far more likely to influence the response. And many advisors that I know say we give the risk profiling tool to the client to take away and complete. But the point I wanted to make, this goes back to us as an industry, a key point about when you choose a risk profiling tool is that it shouldn't be gobbledygook. It should say it should be simple enough for a layman to understand, and if it doesn't, you probably should think twice about using
I think that's
a great point. And I think some people like Morningstar have made a key point to get, you know, the plain English type sign off on the questions that they're asking. I think we've also got to trust that a number of these tools have benchmarked their output so that they check that they're consistently getting the response that you want. And then the final point is the output then is just a start of a discussion. If we're going to take that output and we're not going to have a discussion with it, then maybe we've got some issues. But if we're taking that output and then we're validating that through the discussion with the client, we're using some of the stochastic modelling to create graphs and explain the risk, and then we're validating it, then I think it's far better. I think also bear in mind that some of these tools now have consistency type algorithms within them, so it will flag up how reliable the results are as well. So the tools are getting a lot better, but at the end of the day, the viewer's right, there's a responsibility, I think, at that point to bring in the questioning and checking. I'm not sure whether you want to bring it during the questionnaire, because that can bias the output.
I see. Okay, so it's up for, because advisors use, there are quite a few risk profiling tools out there when you add them all up. Advisors don't all use one or two. There seems to be quite a spread from what I've found. I've also heard that none of them are perfect, so there's even a bit of a combination. There are some very well respected tools out there. Abraham, what's your experience of of this when you're working with advisory businesses? Are you finding that advisors have any concerns about risk profilers? Or?
I think advisors have recognized that, as Mark said, it's just really, for the most part, a discussion tool to start a conversation with the client, to identify inconsistencies and talk to the client. I think there is the recognition that it is just a very useful discussion tool with the client.
Okay. All right. I just want to move on to our next question, which is about the retirement reforms. I thought we should cover that, if only briefly. What have the reforms, which are obviously very sort of far-reaching, meant for assessing suitability? And Mark, can I ask you, the pension reforms, absolutely huge impact on the industry, but what does it mean for advisors when they're now talking to clients in their first instance?
At that point, you've then got far more choice than you had before, so therefore you have to assess the different options available to the client and make sure that you're presenting the best routes forward for them. I think it gives emphasis on having the right discussions with the client to understand what their goals are. Real emphasis on risk now at that point, whereas maybe that wasn't that focus before, and then using the tools to help those discussions again. And I think it's really interesting to see the variety of tools coming out at the moment. Recently judging some awards for innovation, and the vast majority of the innovation is around this area, trying to create tools to communicate very clearly to the end client.
Communicate the concept of risk.
Communicate the concept of risk, but also communicate if you take the money in this way, your tax implications are X, and coming up with financial strategies rather than flogging a product. So, and doing that pictorially.
Sure. Okay.
I think this is sort of a classic example where there is a need to focus on what exactly the consumer actually needs and wants. So forget about individual solutions and products, etc., and work out, well, what is it that you need? Do you need lump sum? Do you need guaranteed retirement income, etc.?
Sure.
And once you understand that, then you can start to look at what the products are. And maybe, because we've gone through a situation where annuity seems to have gone into a stage where that's a terribly bad thing. Nobody wants an annuity. Don't touch it with a barge pole. But if you come at it through a series of questions saying, what is it that you really need in terms of the shape?
Sure.
Then actually you might come and say, well, actually, annuity is an important part of that solution. So I think it's really important that you understand, and I think suitability is absolutely key to make sure you understand client requirements and then match accordingly to it.
Okay.
I think pension reform has set the bars quite high as far as getting to the point where you're comfortable that that the outcome is suitable for the client. And I'm not sure, from talking to advisor, we're still having conversation on Twitter with advisors around sequencing risk and how you model that. I'm not sure that I'm not sure that we've all got to the point where we're totally comfortable, we understand all the risks, and we're able to talk. We'll talk less of able to talk to clients about it. I think it's an incredibly challenging terrain, but advisors and the industry generally are resourceful, and I'm sure we'll learn as we go along.
Okay. I suppose we want to close a little bit by talking about the future of financial advice and the role of technology. This does bring us on to the topic of robo-advice. We have run a poll. I can give you those results now. Most viewers do see robo-advice as an opportunity. Though it's not such a big difference to the first poll. 36% do see robo-advice as a threat to their business. So I wanted to ask what the panel thought specifically. I mean, we may very well deal with robo-advice at a future event, but what are your sort of overall thoughts on this, Abraham?
How long have you got? I think that for the vast majority of advisors, robo-advice is an opportunity, but one that would really cause advisors to raise their games. You know, people will say things like robo-advise are just essentially online tools, and they don't really give advice and give financial planning, and they're not really comparable with what we offer. Well, there might be some truth in that, and we know that, but the end client doesn't know that. And Vanguard is a prime example of that in the US. So for 30 basis points, you can have proper risk profiling process, straight through to onboarding, a portfolio construction that is suitable for client, and you get to talk to a certified financial planner for 30 basis points. Right?
Okay.
So this is good. I think the opportunity is that some of the challenges that we have around just right from onboarding clients straight through to you know, portfolio construction, I think we get to a point where hopefully technology does that. The technology does a bit of that, and the advisor focuses on what they do best, high contact, trying to really understand the client and what the client's trying to achieve. And it might just be that they need to tweak the solution a little bit to ultimately get there. But things like rebalancing portfolios that we spend huge amount of time doing, humongous amount of paper being sent out to client. You know, have you open an account on a platform, see how the deluge of paper that gets sent out to your client. Robo-advice cuts that out. So for me, robo-advice isn't a threat to advisor. It just makes advisors become invincible. If we adopt it and it's done well, I think it's an incredible opportunity.
And if it's part of a total solution, so the robo-advice might be something that you ask them to use for one area of your business. It might be, again, you know, ISA season, you want to just quickly process some business that way, but when you come to do your annual review, you actually still want face-to-face type contact, but all running off the same joined up processes and joined up data so that we can see a single view of this client experience. So I think for some it will be the entire experience, particularly lower down the market. But I think we should, for many advisors, it will be part of what they do, not a replacement for what they do.
I think that's right. Yes, and you know, I think you know, we've seen and we've been talking about, you know, the rise of technology. That is not going to suddenly stop. So yes, as we go further forward, I expect the pace of change to accelerate, if anything. So yes, the process will actually get a lot simpler and a lot quicker. I mean, things like filling in, you know, fact finds, spend a lot of time doing that. It won't be too long, I would imagine, before our data is all held centrally stored, etc. And that can be automatically fed through. So I think that the processes themselves will get a lot quicker, a lot more streamlined. And will we start to give simple advice in simple areas for customers, you know, of less complicated needs? I'm sure we will. And as you quite rightly say, the opportunity is for advisors to become part of that journey and to create that holistic overall service, so that, yeah, you can deal with your own ISA this year, etc. But when you want to talk about longer term complex financial planning or inheritance tax, then that's available, and I don't have to rekey and tell you everything all again. It's all there already for me. So it's a mix.
Yeah, the interesting thing I saw on Twitter the other day was, you know, someone says, you know, I need a portfolio. I need a portfolio for my investment. You know, robo-advice says, here it is. And someone goes, I'm thinking of divorcing my wife. Robo-advice says, you know, so it's the complex, areas that is based on human emotions and all the complicated things going on in our life. Someone's going to, you know, into care, and they need planning. So we can focus on, you know, planning, right? And that's what robo-advice gets us to the point where we can focus on planning rather than chasing paper and data and chasing our tails, basically.
It's all the admin side. So we do actually have another slide, just quickly, on, it may already be live on your screens. which is looking at the robo-advice market in the US. Why am I showing you the US market? It's no relevant. I kind of take that point. But it does go to show the size of one of their financial engines, 104 billion assets. Obviously, maybe not quite so impressive in the US market as that would be here. But it does go to show the interest in the market over there. Now, there's a difference, isn't there, between some of these robo-advice models that do employ a hybrid of a bit of advisor, a bit of electronics. But do you, Mark, do you ever envisage a time when we may be able to make a similar slide as this for the UK in the next 20 years or so?
Well, next 20 years, definitely. And I think it'll depend what part of the market you look at. So you can see certain areas like worksite where this sort of activity is going to absolutely take off a lot quicker. But again, I think some of those hybrid models will then gain momentum. I think what will be interesting is how some of the big brands, so some of the bigger organisations come in and adopt this, you know, will it be the banks, will it be building societies, will it be brands that have nothing to do with financial services at the moment that come in here that can have the money to invest in this area?
Okay. Right, would anybody like to add anything at all to the idea of there being a large robo-advice presence in the UK over the next decade? I said 20 years, but it seems that it would be sooner, in Mark's opinion.
Yes, I share the view. I think it's almost inevitable for a certain segment of the market. I think it absolutely will appeal. I think you're quite right. You know, there are some interesting pricing models in there, which mean it will be, you know, cheaper. And I think it will probably actually, conversely, it might appeal to the people who actually know what they're doing, who are saying, well, actually, I just really wanted to delegate this task. I could have done it myself. I could have set a portfolio. And if there's a tool and a way of doing it really cheaply and quickly, I'm very happy with that. Does it address the market that actually wants some real genuine help? As you correctly said, maybe not. I think maybe there's different solutions in that particular area. So can I see it happening? Yes, absolutely I can. Will it be for everybody? Absolutely not.
It's working out that business proposition. I think that's what each firm has to do, is how they're going to use it. Is it to attack the mass market that they currently can't afford to do it? Is it a value-added service for their high net worth clients that want more instant service in some instances? You know, just getting that balance right of where it fits into your overall business proposition.
Or as you say, for individual clients, it's perhaps part and part. You know, it's saying for this you want face to face, and for that you can do it on your own, and you can mix and match.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today. Before we go, I did mention at the beginning about CPD. I meant to mention it earlier, I apologise, but if you would like to claim your CPD credits for this live event, you can send us your details via the Ask a Question tab on the website. If you click Ask a Question and just send us your name and email address, we can be in touch to ensure that you get that accreditation. Thank you very much for joining us for this live debate on advisor technology. Thank you to Chris, Abraham and Mark for joining us, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.